Example 9. We're now going to get into multiplying terms. And when we multiply, they don't need to be like terms. Especially, in fact, I'll even come right down here and do this one first, letter F. 8w and negative 4y, they are not like terms. But when we multiply them, we multiply the coefficients together. 8 times negative 4 is a negative 32, and then times a w and times a y. So we have all of these things being multiplied together. We can multiply together whatever we're able to, which in this case, again, the 8 times the negative 4 is a negative 32 wy. But here in letter A, 4x times 5x, the x times the x, I could do as many steps here. It'd be 4 times 5 is 20 times x times x. It's just that x times x is x squared. So we should just write it as x squared. That'll be very similar here. Y times y is y squared. And these terms, everything's being multiplied together. Negative 3 times y times 8 times y. In that case, the coefficients, negative 3 and 8, can multiply together. Negative 24. Y times y, y squared. See this letter C? CW, C negative 2w. The coefficient of the second term is negative 2. What's the coefficient of the first term? You got it. It's 1. It's right. 1. The invisible 1. I can write it in. But notice that when we multiply the coefficients, 1 times negative 2, 1 times anything is just itself. So 1 times negative 2 is negative 2. W times w, w squared. Now, I just want to point out that these are all being multiplied together here. Multiplication, multiplication throughout. We're not adding terms or subtracting terms. We're multiplying terms. And so the ideas take on a different, not a different meaning, but we don't use the same procedures. We don't need to have them be like terms. Like here, we have just a 3 and a 6x squared, but we'll multiply. We're not supposed to add or subtract. We can multiply. 3 times 6 is 18. That's 18x squared. Letter E, negative 4y times negative 2. Negative 4 times negative 2, the coefficients, positive 8. And it's y. There's no y squared or anything else. It's just y. Positive 8y. Okay? All right. Next. Exercise 10. Distributive property. Now, in the book, there's some information about why the distributive property works the way it does. There's even information about, let me just go back for a moment, when we multiply, why it is that we kind of get the answers that we get. There's information in the book. There's explanation there. So read that. All right? And as far as the distributive property is concerned, you'll need to become familiar with it. And again, there's explanation as to why it works the way it does. But basically what happens here, this is 5 times y. It's the 5 times that will distribute to each term. So I could write it all out. I could say 5 times the 7y, and this gets a little bit confusing when I write it out this way. I'm going to write it this way. Minus 3, but still times the 5, because everything will multiply times the 5. The 5 will multiply times the 7y. The 5 will multiply by the negative 3. And when we simplify that, that's 35y minus 15. By the way, these are not like terms, so they can't combine. We're done. We're done. Cannot combine. But again, it's just 5 times 7y and 5 times negative 3. 5 times 7y, 35y. 5 times negative 3 is negative 15. We could really do these in one step, and we probably should practice that. 2 times 4. 2 times a negative 6c. That's the whole term. Well, 2 times 4 is 8. 2 times a negative 6c is a negative 12c. 2 times negative 6 is negative 12. This time, we don't see this often, but it's okay. The multiplier is on the right side, yet it'll still multiply in. 8 times 5y is 4. Excuse me, I said y, I meant w. 8 times 5w is 40w, because we'll really multiply the 8 times the 5. 8 times negative 2 is a negative 16. Okay? So that's multiplying terms together. Multiplying terms. That was exercise 10. On page 11. Yes, that's right. I want to make sure I got all of those problems, and I did. Moving on. Exercise 11, more distribution. What's different is that all of these multipliers here are negative this time. In the previous example, they were all positive. Also, in the previous example, let me just take a quick peek back there. Sometimes these are all minus. They don't have to be. Sometimes they'll be plus. Sometimes they'll be minus. But all of these multipliers out in front were positive. Oop, here's a positive 8. As I said, this time all of the multipliers are negative. So when we multiply a negative 5 times a 7x, we've got to be thinking about that. And negative 5 times a positive 3. Negative 5 times 7x is negative 35x. Negative 5 times positive 3, negative 5 times positive 3 is a negative 15. But that negative 15 shows up as minus 15. Yeah? All right. Good. Here we go. Negative 2 times 4c. And then negative 2 times negative 6. Wow. Negative 2 times 4c. Negative 2 times negative 6. Negative 2 times 4c is negative 8c. Negative 2 times negative 6. Positive 12. That's right. Positive 12. Good. Distribute negative 8 through, first of all, times negative 5. And here, negative 8 times positive 2y. Let's see what we get. Negative 8 times negative 5. Negative times negative is positive. In fact, I'll write that down, a little plus sign for positive. 8 times 5 is 40. So that's positive 40, or just 40. Then negative 8 times a positive 2y is a negative 16y. Okay. Negative 3 here times a negative 6. So those are like constant times constant. Then negative 3 times negative, good, 1y. Excellent. I'm going to write that 1 in. We don't need it, but sometimes it's just really helpful. So negative 3 times negative 6, and we'll come back and negative 3 times negative 1y. Let's see what we get. Negative 3 times negative 6, positive 18. Negative 3 times negative 1. Negative times negative is, yep, positive. Positive 1. Whoops. Negative 3 times negative 1 is a positive 3. Positive 3y. Negative 3 times negative 1y. Boy, I almost made that harder than it had to be, huh? Excuse me. Okay. Exercise 12. This time, what's different is we're distributing through a variable. Here's a variable term, negative 3w and negative 2y. That variable is going to multiply through to each of these. It's not a number by itself anymore, not a constant, except for the last one here. That's a 4 times x squared and 4 times x. X times x. X times x. If I wrote it out long way, it would be x times x plus x times 4, if I wrote it out the long way. But that's going to be x times x is x squared plus 4x. And this end result over here, I'll just put a box around that real quickly. That's what we're working toward. That can be found immediately, actually. X times x is x squared. X times 4, 4x. And the plus sign is the plus sign. Negative 3w times w. If we needed to, we could write this here as a 1w. If that's helpful, it might not be helpful. Maybe it gets in the way. I don't know. Negative 3w times 1w is a negative 3w squared. But then, and that was right there, negative 3w times negative 2, well, I think that's a positive 6. Positive 6w. Yep, it is. In the next one, 2y times 8y. Now we just got done multiplying terms together, right? So this is just more of the same. Multiplying 2y times 8y. Well, that's 16y squared. But I'm not going to write it over there. I want to write it over here, really. 16y squared. And then 2y times a negative 7 is a negative 14y. Okay? Here, let's distribute x times y. Now, it's not going to be x squared, or even y squared, or anything. It's just x times y, xy. And x times a positive 2. X times y is xy. X times 2, I don't want to write it as x2. It's much better if we write it as 2x. That's the form that we're more familiar with. Okay, and here's the w. The w multiplied by a 9w and by a negative 1. 9w squared, w times w, minus w times negative 1 is negative 1w. Or, I could have written this as 9w squared minus w. Okay? Let's see. I think this is the last example in the whole section. Yippee! This one, recall, I said it was just a constant 4 times the x squared and 4 times the x, and we won't be able to combine them after that. It's simply 4x squared plus 4x. And they won't combine. And that's it. That's section 1.9. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I hope you've been able to say algebraic expressions and coefficient and things like that, and distributive property. Yes. Hopefully you'll be able to talk better than I'm able to talk. All right? Well, take it easy. I guess I'll see you in chapter 2, won't I? I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks.